Welcome to this session of PFS CARE Collegial Conversations Professional Development Series. The topic for this presentation is the connection between family-school partnerships and student attendance. Collegial Conversations Professional Development Series are made possible through IES support as part of the PFS CARE project. The agenda for today's session includes an overview of attendance, including terminology associated with attendance, the relevance of family partnerships in supporting student attendance, the impact these partnerships can have on supporting student attendance, and finally, some practical tips. Moving into the overview of student attendance, we're going to start with discussing some terminology related. Here are some important terms to consider when discussing student attendance. There's several definitions that are associated with attendance. The first one is average daily attendance, and this is a school level measure. So this is when we take a look at the whole student population and we look at attendance data at certain points in times. This can be beneficial in looking at whole group average attendance, but it often masks individual student chronic absences. The next term is truancy. Truancy typically only counts unexcused absences, and it focuses on an individual student's compliance with the student rules. Truancy is often used as part of a legal system, and it's typically more blaming and includes punitive solutions rather than problem solving. Chronic absence counts all absences for an individual student, and it emphasizes the impact of missed school days. We can use measures of chronic absence in a preventative, problem-solving, and trauma-sensitive way. When we're talking about chronic absence, we must consider family and student engagement. So delving a little bit deeper into chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is generally referred to as a student missing 10% or more of school for any reasons at all. So as I previously mentioned, this includes excused absences, it includes unexcused absences, and it also includes disciplinary actions such as suspensions. All three of those are included in the count for chronic absence. And what we know is that students who are chronically absent for any reason, even if it is an excused absence, say for like a family vacation, all of the absences put the student at risk educationally. So when we think about students being absent from school, it's really important for us to consider the reasons why students might miss school. Some of these reasons are seen as more typical or perceived as more typical by those of us in the education system. Some of these are more systemic and are underlying, and so we might have to dig a little bit to find out what the cause is for a student's absences. We're going to revisit this a little later in the session, but it's really important for us to delve a little deeper, analyze why an individual student is missing school so that we can address the absenteeism appropriately and with interventions that match those causes for missing school. So let's take a look at the data around chronic absenteeism. We know that COVID-19 definitely negatively impacted attendance at school. and we're still recovering from those absenteeism numbers. So let's take a look at the pre and post-pandemic data. This is on a national level. So in the school year 2017-2018 compared to school year 2021-22, we see the numbers have over doubled for chronic absenteeism. So we were at 28% in 2017-18, and that jumped to 65% in 21-22. And we're still trying to recover from that pandemic effect of absenteeism. So essentially what this amounts to is an increase from 8 million students in 2017-18 to 14.7 million students in the school year 21-22. So now let's take a look at some Arizona data from those same school years. We see that Arizona was higher than the national average for chronic absenteeism prior to the pandemic, and has grown even more significantly since post-pandemic. And again, we're still in the process of recovering from absenteeism since the pandemic. So why does this matter? Obviously, if you're in education, you know that it's important for kids to be in school. When we take a look, we can even further disaggregate the data, and we can see that those students who already have been at risk are even at higher risks when it comes to absenteeism and not being in school. So disaggregating that data on a national level, in 21-22, the largest number of chronically absent students were Latino, Hispanic, white, and then Black. The rates for chronically absent were highest for our indigenous populations at 70.9%, Black students at 55.5%, and Latino Hispanic students at 55.5% as well. Also, students with disabilities had rates of 56.9% with chronic absenteeism, and our ELL students had chronic absenteeism at 51.5%. So, it's possible to take a look even deeper at the data and see which groups are most impacted right now with chronic absenteeism. What we know from the research is that when 20% or more of students are chronically absent, it affects all students and teachers. And so thinking about that data that I just showed you, we're well above 20% or more of students in Arizona as well as nationwide that are chronically absent. And so the impact is widespread. It's not just on the students who are absent. One research study showed that there's a peer effect. And so when students are absent, their peers are more likely to be absent as well. Now, we all know that when students miss instruction, they're missing important academic content. But beyond that, they're also missing other opportunities that contribute to self-efficacy, social skills, learning, and a sense of belonging. And we know even further down the road that there are more negative outcomes that happen that are correlated with excessive absenteeism. So dropout rates, graduation rates, attendance at post-secondary options, employment opportunities. So the impact of absenteeism is wide-reaching. We know that to improve attendance, especially for younger students, but I would advocate even for those that are in middle school and high school, we have to have a strong family engagement component. especially for the little kids, if they're not getting to school, typically it's the parents who are responsible for getting the students up and ready for the bus or dropped off at school, that sort of thing. So it makes sense that we would need to include the family. But again, even at those older grades, having collaboration with families and engagement with families helps us to support students getting to school. As I already mentioned, we also need to delve a little bit deeper into our own school and district data so that we can develop and tailor intervention strategies that are appropriate for our students and our community. So as I just mentioned, the impact of students missing school is widespread, and it has this ripple effect. So obviously with the student has missed instruction time, it impacts their relationships, it impacts their social interactions, but it also impacts other students. As I mentioned, the research has shown that there is a peer effect for students missing school, so it can spread among the peer group. Also, when students come back to class, the need for reteaching slows down the entire group. And so, there's an impact on the other students in the classroom as well. It impacts student groups. So if we think about work groups and the collaboration that we want our students to do together, it impacts that. And, there's higher workloads on the students who are in class, and there's less collaboration available when students are missing school. It can have an impact on our teachers. So teachers have lost time explaining what was missed and reteaching. If absences are unexpected, it can cause a change in the need for the teacher's lesson. And just beyond the academics, the whole classroom environment and how the teacher manages the class. We also see it in our schools. So when we have decreased instructional time, we generally have decreased achievement. And you can look up data on achievement tests right now and see that our reading and math scores nationally are still recovering from pre-pandemic levels. And so we have decreased achievement, and then we also sometimes have an increase in the number of remedial classes that our schools need. So it definitely impacts the whole system. Data from 21-22 suggested that 2 out of 3 students attend a school with 20% or more absenteeism. And remember, I just shared that 20% is kind of that number that we want to be below to keep a healthy, well-functioning school system. So it goes without saying that family-school partnerships are imperative to help with attendance issues. Family-school partnerships and family engagement have a widespread impact on educational success of students. And one of those indicators of success is school attendance. So these are positive conditions for learning. So these are things that need to be in place for a student to have optimal learning. And you can see that one piece of this is that academic challenge. So focusing on the achievement, focusing on the rigor, focusing on the quality of instruction is one of 4 areas or conditions that must exist for learning. The other 3 folks might not necessarily have thought of, or not thought of the significance that these conditions play in student achievement and learning. So the other three areas are the adult and the student well-being and emotional competence. So this takes into account our teachers, our administrators, our support staff, our students, as well as our families. And so when we have healthy well-being and strong emotional competence, that's a positive condition for student learning. The other factor is physical and emotional health and safety. And so when we think back to the barriers that I showed a few slides ago, some of those barriers or why students are missing school fall into this condition. And so they may not be physically healthy. They may not have health insurance. They may have had trauma in their past. And so they're lacking that emotional health and safety. And then finally, belonging, connection, and support. And this condition is so important, and there's just a plethora of research that shows us that when kids and families and educators feel a sense of belonging, connection, and support in the school system, that there's an increase in learning outcomes. Now, what these four conditions share is at the foundation of all four of these is relationships. And so we have to have relationships in order to have these other positive conditions for learning. And when we talk about family-school partnerships and the impact these have on various educational outcomes and educational successes for students, attendance is a piece of that as well. So in our work with families, and this definitely applies to what we think about kids missing school, is shifting our perspective from a deficit model to a partnership model. So we want to focus on being strength-based and collaborative. So from the deficit model, and again, we can talk about this specifically with attendance, but it holds true for other educational indicators of success. In the deficit model, we contact a family only when there's a problem. We have one-way communication. We focus on the barriers and can be punitive with consequences. And there's a presumption that school and educator has all of the answers. So we want to shift that thinking to that partnership model, which is more collaborative. So we want to have outreach that is initially focusing on building a relationship. So we want to be preventative. We don't want to make the phone call only, or the contact with the family only after there's a concern for attendance. We want to have had a positive interaction with the family prior to that. We also want to listen to our families. And so we want to engage in a bi-directional communication and recognize that the families are the experts in their family system and in their community, as well as with their child. And so we need them to work with so that we can come up with plans that are truly supportive of the child. And looking, again, that strength-based, believing that every family has strengths. And so how can we help the family leverage those strengths to overcome the challenges? And finally, collaboration that encourages that families build around their assets and their priorities while working within the school system. So we can rethink attendance interventions. We have, when kids are struggling academically, if it truly is a can't do and it isn't related to a won't do or a lack of coming to school, we can focus on academic interventions. Similarly, with behavioral interventions, we can take a look at the can't do, won't do. And if we determine that it truly is something that a child can work on, we can just go to behavioral interventions. We can also take a look at some parenting practices. And so those of you who are familiar with our program know that we offer resources for parents for things like limit setting or setting up a homework routine or getting to school on time. And so being a conduit for parents to hone some of their parenting practices to support student learning. At the foundation of all of these, however, is the family-school partnership. And so we know that our academic interventions, our behavioral interventions, and our parenting practices interventions all rely on, or are all better when we have those family-school partnerships. So one of the things that, or several things that we need to consider when we think about students and families and student attendance, these are 4 considerations that we need to have with families. So what the literature shows us is that these 4 areas, if you will, when families and students have these, they're more likely to attend school. So when families and students have hope for a better future, when they have belief in the school system that the school will actually help their child succeed, when they feel like they have a voice in decisions that affect the child and the family, and when they have access to needed supports and services. When all of those are present, this links to better attendance. So thinking about school-based supports for parents, we really want our families to view the school as a resource. Again, this comes back to that bi-directional communication and that collaboration. So thinking beyond what it is that we need from families to what it is we can provide for families. We can provide some parenting support. We can provide advocacy and outreach for our families, and we can think differently about our opportunities for involvement. So if a school has, pretty standard ways that a family can be involved, so volunteering in the classroom, coming along on a field trip, coming to read to the class on a Friday, coming for, dads with donuts or muffins with moms. And we're pretty prescriptive about how we offer opportunities for involvement. That can be really limiting. And so we have to think beyond and get our families' feedback in how they might want to be involved or what things that they might be able to do and be present for that we might not otherwise think of. So when we approach this work through those different lenses, we work on empowering our families, giving them autonomy, establishing those collaborative relationships, and creating those a school culture and climate that's welcoming and safe, and then having that shared responsibility for student outcomes. So it's not all on the family, it's not all on us as educators, it's a joint effort, and we have a common goal in helping a student succeed. So the good news is there is data, there is research, there is literature that shows us when we have these partnerships with families, we can have a positive impact on school attendance. So the Kansas State Department of Education, they shared some data recently where they had already been using a family engagement survey, which I would strongly encourage. That's a tool that you can use to solicit feedback from your families, input from your families, and there's several various surveys that are out there that are actually free to use. But this particular survey focused on several different areas. So a welcoming environment, supporting student learning, effective communication, sharing power and advocacy, and community involvement. So they already had this tool in place, and they started to look at the data and put interventions in place that addressed some of the areas of need or challenge areas that the data from this survey suggested. And basically what they found was that as they had increased family engagement, and again, using this tool to measure family engagement, what they found was that more students attended school regularly, and attendance was specifically, they did an overall score, which was the FES total average, but then they also found that having a welcoming environment and sharing power and advocacy with families directly related to an increase in school attendance. Obviously, if kids are in school, then it makes sense that then we see achievement increases. And so they looked at their ELA assessment and their math assessment proficiency, and found that as their absenteeism as family engagement increased, students were coming to school more regularly, and they saw an increase in their achievement scores. Another example was in Connecticut, which, looking at the national averages and the state averages for Arizona, these numbers for absenteeism seem lower. But during the pandemic, their levels of chronic absenteeism doubled from 12% to 25%. And they found that the most successful approach was reaching out to families. They targeted home visits, and they employed thousands of volunteers that included teachers, superintendents, student leaders, community members. And basically the message that they delivered was, we miss you, we want you back, how can we make that happen? And the volunteers reported that they heard the families opened up, and they heard many different barriers and reasons why students weren't coming to school, including, teenagers working to help support the family, or a parent needing a child to translate for medical appointments, or a student who'd been out of school and was nervous about bullying. So this goes back to, taking a look at why is it that kids aren't coming to school, so you can design an appropriate intervention. Here's another example. This is called the Family Engagement Impact Study. And this is based around something called the 5 Essentials Survey, which is used widely in Illinois. And basically, researchers determined that there were 5 major areas, 5 essential components for student success. And that included having effective leaders, having a supportive environment, having ambitious instruction, involved families, and collaborative teachers. So this focused specifically on the component of involved families, and there's 3 pieces that go into that component. So one is parent influence on decision making, parent involvement in school, and teacher-parent trust. And what they found through this survey was that when the 5 Essentials survey showed high family engagement, there was a decrease in chronic absenteeism. So a 39% decrease in chronic absenteeism. And there was also an increase in ELA and math proficiency rates. So this is over just a couple year period. And so, seeing that, having that family engagement, that family partnership, and you can probably see some common themes coming through here now about parents having a voice, parents feeling involved, and parents having trusting relationship with educators. Has a direct relationship to reducing chronic absenteeism and increasing achievement rates. Other things that this impact study showed was that, overall, we know nationwide that attendance and learning outcomes got worse during the pandemic. But what they saw was that schools that had strong family engagement prior to the pandemic experienced smaller increases in chronic absenteeism and declines in attendance and achievement. So there seemed to be a protective factor with that family engagement against the effects of the pandemic. And then the other thing that they found was that a school's pre-pandemic family engagement was more strongly related to chronic absenteeism than the percent of low-income students it serves. So this is an important piece because I think sometimes schools discount families from low-income communities as perhaps not having time at the best case scenario to not caring at the worst case scenario. And what we see is that when we have strong family engagement, strong family school partnerships, strong trust in school systems, that's a higher predictor of student attendance than coming from a low income community. And these findings applied to different types of schools. So again, when I was talking earlier about knowing your context, this is true for rural schools, for urban schools, for suburban schools, for large schools, for small schools, for schools in marginalized communities, as well as those from more affluent areas. So moving on to some practical tips. We can link attendance to tiered systems of intervention. So when we think about tiered systems of intervention, typically they're around academics or around behavior. So we've got our RTI for academics, we've got PBS for behaviors, we have MTSS, which encompasses kind of the whole shebang, but we can also think about attendance in this tiered model as well. And so, we want to have that foundational support. I already mentioned about how chronic absenteeism impacts multiple systems. And so we want to have a foundational support that is district-wide that promotes those positive conditions for learning. So those 4 conditions that I mentioned earlier. Then, our tier 1 universal prevention, those are, our policies and our communication about our policies and our expectations. And then we can start to identify, we can start to look at our data and see what students are already missing that 10%. And so we could have time periods, maybe once a month, at the very least quarterly, where we're taking a look at data and then referring kids for that tier 2 intervention. And then finally, those kids that are missing 20% or more, referring them for more intensive intervention. So we can think about addressing chronic absenteeism through this tiered system of intervention. So here's an example from the Kansas State Department of Education. This is our triangle inverted. But basically, this is what their tiered intervention plan looks at for absenteeism. And they go, tier 1 prevention to tier 3 specialized supports. And they've also noted some fiscal information about this. And so, basically what we know, and this is true for attendance, it's true for behavior, it's true for academics, is that when we have universal supports and kids are being successful with those universal supports, that's a lower cost for a school operating system than when we get to those tier 3 supports. So, monitoring data, creating a school team that regularly reviews attendance data if you don't already have one in place, and having that team take a look at the individual data, notifying or looking at trends in absences and possible barriers, and then engaging students and parents. So creating a school climate that encourages students to come to school every day, that they want to be there, that they're going to nag their parents if they're missing school. And providing activities that are engaging to both our students and families. So again, thinking beyond what we typically would do for families to be involved in school. recognizing good and improved attendance, and providing that personalized early outreach. So we want to look at data like globally, holistically, but we also definitely want to look at it on an individual level, because the reason for one student missing school probably is markedly different than another a student. And then again, thinking about those barriers to attendance and working with staff, students, parents, and community partners to address those barriers that are unique for your student, your school, and or your district. There was a recent summit called the Everyday Counts Summit, and it was actually a White House summit that featured school district leaders, educational advocates, and state officials discussing how communities can best address chronic absenteeism, why chronic absenteeism matters, and basically what that found, that those discussions found that schools that are finding success in combating the problem of chronic absenteeism tended to have one thing in common, and that was that they leveraged help from outside of the school, including community groups, families, and political leaders. And so really taking that community approach to addressing attendance issues is extremely important. In a podcast that was recently done at Harvard, 3 pillars were identified for engaging families to help support chronic absenteeism. Building relationships. So we see this over and over and over again. You can look at any research, and this is the common thread that goes through all of these, is building those relationships, reinforcing trust, working together. The second pillar was focusing on student learning and well-being. So again, we have that one common goal, which is to help the child succeed. And then building an infrastructure to support attendance. And again, this needs to be done at multiple levels, and we can enlist the help of our community partners to do so. Here's another resource. It's action planning for re-engaging missing students. I actually have put this in the resource section of this presentation. This is from the Student Engagement and Attendance Center, and it's an actual worksheet that schools and districts can go through to re-engage missing students. So the identified partners, thinking about what voices need to be present at this planning. Is there a team that exists that has the capacity to do this work, or do you need to establish a team? How do you set up a team for shared power and access? And again, we want to move beyond just school personnel and move out to our families and our community partners, and how can we compensate collaborators? So this doesn't necessarily have to be financial compensation, but thinking about how is it that we can show folks that we value the work that they're doing in this area. We want to collect and examine data, so we're going to look at quantitative as well as qualitative data. And so, the absence or attendance records from schools. You can, if you have a family engagement survey, doing something like that. You might do focus groups. Whatever the team decides is going to produce data that will help inform interventions and decision making. Completing that root cause analysis. And so this is going back to that, like, why are students missing school? So when we do a root cause analysis, we develop a problem statement, which in this case could be, that 45% of the students at XYZ middle school meet the threshold for chronic absenteeism. We want to look at the underlying causes. So why is it that students are missing school? What are some of the contributing causes? And then that leads us all to this root cause. And once we've identified the root cause, we can identify strategies to address the problem. And we want to look at evidence-based practices. So not just kind of what we think or what we have a hunch about, but looking for those practices that have really been shown to have an impact on student attendance. And then we want to do a what's called a plan, do, study, act cycle for each strategy. So a PDSA. So this is about we implement, we collect data to see if it's effective, and we look at our strategies. Like maybe it was effective, but maybe it was way too time consuming and the school doesn't have the capacity or the resources to do it. So then we might have to tweak it. And then we iterate as needed. So maybe it worked great. Maybe one of our strategies worked great. So now we tried it at the 6th grade level. Now we're gonna expand it to the 7th grade level. And so going through this process in a very purposeful, intentional way to address attendance issues. So just some general principles. You can see establish a positive relationship. We want to do this for a variety of reasons. Like I said, this goes beyond just attendance. It goes on to impact many educational outcomes for kiddos, but establishing that positive relationship with our families. We want to engage early and we want to engage often. So we want to start the outreach to families maybe before the school year even starts, but certainly by back to school night. We want to leverage what are our existing activities that communicate the importance of good attendance, and how can we embed more information about attendance into those already existing activities. We want to take a strengths-based approach. So it can be easy to put blame on families for not getting their kids to school, but we really want to shift that mindset into a strength-based approach and believe that all of our families have strengths. We definitely want to consider culture and language. So this work especially should be founded in trauma-informed and culturally responsive practices. This is not a one-size-fits-all, and we need to understand our families and our students from a holistic perspective. It's an ongoing process. This is not a one and done, like, hey, we've given you the information at the beginning of the year and you're just left to deal with it for the rest of the year. It's an ongoing process, ongoing conversation. Some other tips, some that we've already talked about before. We want to think about the root cause of absenteeism. There might be a group that has the same root cause, or it might be individuals that have different root causes, but we can't go to the intervention phase unless we know what the root cause is for the problem. Again, orienting our parents on the school policies and expectations, providing parents with the name of somebody they can contact at school. Taking that culturally responsive and trauma-informed approach. Do you have a family support worker or a family liaison, or somebody who can serve as a conduit for the family, a contact for the family. I'm thinking about making home visits and community visits. I shared with you what happened in Connecticut about the power of the home visit. There's a whole training. There's a lot of literature about best practice in home visits. So if that's something that your school wants to do, I would certainly encourage you to research and just set up a true system for home visiting. Using our data, again, that quantitative and qualitative data, not just the gut feeling, but having what we're noticing and what we're doing based in data. Realizing that there might be a difference in perspectives. This gets back to that culturally responsive approach. I know here in Arizona that sometimes our families, especially from different populations, will leave school for a month. And so realizing that might be a cultural perspective that's different than our westernized perspective here in the US school system. And so how do we bridge that gap? engaging in strength-based, solution-focused response rather than punitive. Because when we focus too heavily on the consequences, that isn't incentivizing for kids then to show up at school. So in summary, chronic absenteeism remains a significant problem in the K-12 education system here in Arizona, nationwide. When students miss school, multiple areas are potentially impacted, not just their academic achievement, and these areas can have long-lasting impact. Research has shown that family-school partnerships can reduce chronic absenteeism and improve educational outcomes for students. Addressing absenteeism involves multiple systems. It impacts multiple systems, and the solution lies in multiple systems. And as with all areas of family-school partnership, it begins with building that positive, reciprocal, collaborative relationship of trust. Thank you very much for listening to this Collegial conversation. If you have questions or comments, you can email the PFS CARE team at pfscare@asu.edu. And here are some of the resources that I mentioned that can help you in addressing attendance problems at your school.